Good evening and a very warm welcome to everybody to the BCSWomen Scotland's first virtual event. I'm Paula Quiller from the BCSWomen Scotland team and I'll be your chair this evening. We're delighted to be joined by Corey Burrows, career coach and founder of Careerfully Poised, to talk to us about how to play to your strengths, something that we may not do in the best of times, and currently we may actually find ourselves losing sight of what our strengths are just now. So hello and welcome to Corey.
Hello.
So everybody's aware, we're going to be recording today's event, and after the session you'll receive a copy of Corey's presentation. So don't worry about having to scribble down lots of notes unless you really want to. Before handing over to Corey, what I'd like to do is extend a welcome both to our BCS members and those joining a BCS or BCSWomen Scotland event for the first time. For our Scottish members, it's been quite a while since we last had an event, and after the lockdown hiatus, this is the first of a series of events that we're planning. For those of you joining us for the very first time, thank you for joining us today, and you may not actually have come across BCSWomen before. The British Computer Society, which BCSWomen is part of, is the Chartered Institute of IT. And BCSWomen exists to be a powerful, inclusive and global network to encourage girls and women in all areas of IT. As a group, our strategy is to attract women and girls into technology and then retain and empower them as they go through their careers, with events like today's and other events that we have throughout the year. I'll now hand over to Corey. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the session. And if you do have questions, if you could please put them in the Q&A section, which appears at the top of the screen with a question mark icon. So over to yourself, Corey.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paula. Firstly, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone for joining us. I am conscious at the moment that we are in very unusual times, and I'm sure there are many ways that you could have been spending this evening. So thank you very much for choosing to spend the next hour with us. As Paula said, I'm going to be talking about how to play to your strengths and how success comes from what you're from focusing on what you're good at. I'm hoping to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we should have a nice chunk of time at the end for Q&A. As Paula said, if you can use the Q&A panel to put your questions in, we're going to save them until the end, so apologies, I won't be looking at them as we go through the presentation, but there should be plenty of time for them at the end of the session. And as Paula said, the slides will go out after the presentation. I'll also be referring to a few resources which are on a page at the back of the slides as well, so don't feel like you need to scroll down the name of all the books and things that I talk about as we go through. You'll get all those details at the end. So if I just take you through what today is going to look like, we're going to talk about why it's important to focus on your strengths. I also want to touch a little bit about how to discover your strengths and those in the people around you. We'll talk about how to use your strengths to drive your career forward, and then a little bit I'd like to touch on the times that we find ourselves in, because as I say, we're in rather unusual times at the moment. And at the end, there'll be time for the Q&A. So before I dive into why I think it's important to play to your strengths, I'd like to talk a little bit about me and why I'm so passionate about focusing on your strengths, and how actually by playing to my strengths, I've built the career that I have and how it's led me to where I am. So I'm going to go a little way back, I'm afraid, to start off with, and talk about when I was at school, which was a little while ago now. I was one of those strange kids who actually really liked school, and not just because I got to see my friends. I loved to learn, and as a kid I made the mistake that I think we all make, and I still make to this day, of assuming that everyone thinks like us. So I would go into school, I really enjoyed going to school, and I loved to learn new things, and I assumed that everyone around me felt the same way. They enjoyed school, they were looking forward to learning new things. As I started to get older, I realised that this wasn't the case. And by secondary school, I'd realised that not everyone did enjoy learning, that they'd figure out their ways of learning. And for me, it started not just to be about learning, but about a process of learning, starting to work out how I learned and how I could learn quicker and easier. And by secondary school, I got pretty good at starting to nail that process of how I learn. I went on to university and I was a pretty effective learner. I could pick things up really quickly because I knew how I learned. And when I graduated in 2010, middle of the recession, great time to be leaving uni, I got a job that was the perfect job for someone like me. Actually, at that point, it was more by accident than by design, because I joined a rotational grad scheme for a big insurance company that unfortunately no longer exists. I went in, and every 6 months, I got to move to a new job. I picked up a new role. I'd be in a new area, working with new teams on new products, and it was fantastic because I could go along, pick up this well-tested process of how I learn things, and I could challenge myself to see how quickly I could learn a new area, a new team, a new product. And then in 6 months' time, I got to do it all over again. When it came to moving on from my first company, at that point, I started to look more intentionally at finding jobs that suited the strength that I'd found, my ability to learn quickly. And I looked at a few different areas, and I ended up in consultancy. Again, another place that really plays to the strength of kind of variety and challenge, liking to learn new things. Because I'd start doing different roles. I'd work with completely different clients, whole different companies. So not only was I learning new products and new teams, I'd be learning the ways of working in a new company every time I tried a new role. And I loved that. And at that point, I'd started to move on from just learning and refining my process of learning to start to realize that I also wanted to give back some of the learning that I was taking in. So while I was working as a consultant, I started running lunch and learn sessions on a Friday with our analysts and consultants. So those who are kind of 2 to 4 years into their career. And in those, we'd talk about what I'd learned through my career and things that I thought might be helpful advice or things to avoid. And at that point, I'd climbed the ladder pretty quickly. I'd become a senior manager in consultancy before I was 30, and I now wanted to help the next ones in line and pass on some of that learning. Around the same time, though, I remember having a conversation with one of the partners, and he said, now that you're a senior manager, you're accepted on the road to partner. And I froze because I suddenly realized that I didn't want to be a partner, that I'd kind of fallen onto this path. I was climbing this ladder that I actually didn't want to get to the top of. And I think it's something that happens for a lot of us. Sometimes it happens kind of 10 years in, like it did for me. For some people, it's 15 or 20 years into a career when they realize that they're climbing the wrong ladder. And that's the point when I started to focus a bit more again on what my strengths were and how I could use them more to my advantage. And this time last year, almost to the day, I left my consultancy job and I went full-time into running my own career consultancy business. I got to use that learning and share the learning that I make and some of my other strengths around building relationships with people. And actually, having talked to a lot of women now in my work, that I've started to realize there is a real pattern of us waking up at some point and realizing that we're not in the right career. And so I now focus on helping women who are starting out in their careers to design intentional careers, to work out what the right ladder is to climb, to even see if they put their ladder against the right wall, or actually for some of them, you need to throw away the ladder and we need to design a staircase that we're going to get to the top of, because those ladders, those standards that are already there, we didn't choose in the first place and they don't suit us. So I spend time working with women one-on-one and in groups to help them work out what those strengths are, to help them climb the right ladder, and to help them balance their priorities in and out of work. And I also work with companies on their grad schemes and women's networks as a speaker and consulting. Earlier this year, I also launched the first report for Careerfully Poised, which was looking at women who started their career on grad schemes and looking at basically the good, the bad and the ugly of grad schemes to feed into the next rounds of ones opening up, which funnily enough, this year has been a bit of a weird year for grad schemes, but hopefully going forwards will have even more of an impact for the next women joining those grad schemes. So I'm really passionate about playing to your strengths, because for me, by figuring out that learning was a strength of mine, I completely changed the direction of my career and was able to drive it forward much quicker than if I hadn't realized how playing to my strength of learning would help me, because I picked the right next job and then I grew quickly through the ranks of that because I knew what my strengths were. But I'm guessing that you're not just going to want to look at what your strengths are because I've said it's worked for me and it's got me where I am. So I want to talk a little bit about why it's important to focus on your strengths. If we start from a company point of view and an employer, the first bit is all around engagement. And we all know that engagement will affect the bottom line of a company. Engaged employees will be more productive, they do work of a higher quality, and they actually will stay longer at a company. And all of those things contribute to an enhancement of the bottom line. So when an organization's leadership focuses on the strength of its employees, the odds of an employee being engaged are 73%. But actually, if they don't focus on the strengths of their employees, if they don't help them figure out what they're good at and help them play to those strengths, basically help them figure out what they're good at and do more of it, then the chances that that employee will be engaged are 9%. And as we said, we know that engagement is a massive driver to the productivity, the quality, and also the retention of staff within a company. I've seen an awful lot of this at the moment around furloughing and actually just the general situation that companies are finding themselves in. There are some really good companies that have continued to focus on engaging their staff, even if it is in process of furloughing people. There's also an awful lot of examples of how not to do it. And if I take some examples of some of these companies, there are many companies that motivate their staff by looking at status and financial incentives. So promotions, bonuses, salary increases, all of that space. And actually along comes something like we found ourselves in now, and suddenly there are no promotions. Pay rises and bonuses are suspended, and people are feeling incredibly disengaged because that was the only way that the company motivated them. Now, if companies had actually spent time focusing on what their employees' strengths were and continuing to help them to develop those and to do more of work in that space, people would be far more engaged now than they are when we use those traditional methods, I guess, of motivating people with financial incentives and with promotions and status. Now, if we talk about it on a one-to-one basis, why should you focus on your strengths? Well, the first one is that it is just easier and more fun if we focus on the things that we're good at. We often start to think about the things that we should be good at, and actually you need to be really careful because should is really dangerous. You'll spend a lot of time thinking about these things that you should be or you could be good at, and they're not actually those things that are your strengths, and you'll end up battling in an uphill battle to try and be good at those things. And actually you could find a much easier way of starting to differentiate yourself by doing the things that you're naturally good at and building on those into strengths. By working on your strengths and doing more with them, it's also a great way to build a reputation at work, to start to differentiate yourself from others around you. And actually, it's a really good way of finding your place in a team. So there is actually no such thing as a well-rounded individual, but teams need to be well-rounded. And so actually knowing what your strengths are and your place in the team, and actually what the strengths are around you, you and the team will know when you play different people into different situations, and it'll make a much more effective team. So you should be looking at your strengths because it will make your life more easier, more fun. It'll help you build a reputation and differentiate yourself from others around you, but it'll also help make your team more effective if you all know what your strengths are and therefore when to play different people into different situations. So hopefully by now you're starting to see why you should focus on your strengths. So if you're thinking, okay, I'm starting to buy this, how do I do it? Let's touch on 3 ways to discover those strengths. So the first one is the kind of more formal way of looking at online tools and books. So here I've got 2 examples of the books and online assessments that you can use, and these are both from Gallup. I'll mention them again towards the end, and I've got details of where you can find more from Gallup in the resources section. They have done an awful lot of research into the space of strengths-based development, as they'd call it, and they've been doing it for many, many years. So there's an awful lot of information and resources that you can look through. But for me, my journey on this started with that top book called Now Discover Your Strengths. It is an oldie but a goodie. I think it was published about 2001. You can still get hold of secondhand copies of it on kind of eBay, Amazon, all of those places. I actually borrowed it from a library, which probably shows how old school I am. And I'm sure it'll still be available in some libraries around you as well, if you decide this is one of the ways that you want to go about discovering your strengths. The book itself is kind of split into 2 halves. The first half talks about why you should be focusing on your strengths and how focusing on your strengths can help your career. And the second half starts to list out the 34 themes that came out of the Gallup research. Basically, these themes are looking at the areas of strengths that came out of their research that they've managed to categorize into 34 themes. And you can go through, and we'll touch on the assessment in a moment, but it basically gives you your top 5 themes of strengths when you look at them. So I'd definitely say if you have a bit of time and can also be quite good at self-reflection, then Now Discover Your Strengths is a great place to start. It is the kind of original book of this space. Now, most of those books will come with a code in the back, but because you're buying it secondhand, the likelihood is that someone will have already used the code. So you won't be able to use the online code to complete the online assessment if you buy a secondhand version of that book, and it's not in print anymore. So you will only be able to get hold of secondhand versions. But as I say, if you can take the time and have, I guess, enough self-awareness to be able to read the themes and start to identify what you can see in yourself, then actually you don't need the online assessment to do that. And I had great fun reading this in a holiday where I could start to identify some strengths and themes in people around me as well, which I really enjoyed. The second version of this is Strengthsfinder 2.0. Now, I actually have one of my copies here. I got this when I was on a grad scheme. And one of the things I would say is that before you run out and buy it yourself, it might be worth trying a bit of negotiation at work and seeing if you can persuade your work to pay for it for you. Now, Strengthsfinder 2.0, again, you can get secondhand copies online, but you can still buy it, and you can just do, instead of having to buy the book, you can just do the online assessment now. It's called Clifton Strengths Assessment, and you'll find it on the Gallup website, details in the resources at the back. This one is about $15, I think, to take part in the assessment. And you go through and basically you complete a series of questions, and it will give you your top 5 in a report. And in true Blue Peter style, here's one I made earlier. This is my report. It's a bit battered now. I've had it a fair few years, but it lists your top 5 strengths. And funnily enough, the top one for me, the first one is learner. And if I just take you through it, it says people who are especially talented in the learner theme have a great desire to learn and want to continuously improve. In particular, the process of learning rather than the outcome excites them, which probably sounds a little familiar to that girl I talked about at school who had a love for learning and didn't realise that that was a strength and not something that everyone else had. So the formal ways of doing this are to go through either the book or the online assessment and get details of what your top 5 themes are, and therefore your strengths that sit under it. And we'll give you a bit of detail about the theme, and it'll also give you some actions that you can take to help move yourself forward in that area. Now, if you don't really want to invest in one of the books or the online assessments, then there are still other ways that you can work out your strengths. One of them is around self-reflection. So you need to spend a bit of time, and you might want to look backwards, but also going forward, starting to track some of these things. So the first one is looking at things that feel easy. Are there things that don't take a lot of effort for you to do? And especially that don't take effort, but when you look around you, you can see that it's harder for some people than it is for you. Also things where you start to lose track of time. So where you get into flow and you could be doing something for 4 hours and actually it feels like it's only taken 30 minutes. There's likely to be something that sits underneath that that links to your key strengths. And feedback. Start to listen to when people tell you about when you've done a really good job. And especially when, again, you start to think, well, that was really easy. They're saying I did a good job, but I don't feel like it's an achievement because it didn't feel like a challenge to me. And actually, those things that feel easy and that other people start to tell you that you've done really well, but you don't think you've done anything special, is often where there's a natural ability that sits under that. That's one of your strengths. And it's back to the mistake that I said I still make today, and I know that I made a lot when I was younger, of assuming that everyone thinks like me. And we do have a habit, particularly as women, of falling into that trap and assuming that because something comes naturally to us, it comes naturally to everyone. And that is not the case. So starting to focus on those things that do come naturally to you, that you find easy, especially when others don't, is something that I see when I'm coaching. Is that I always say when I'm coaching with clients, I don't think that anything I say is rocket science, but sometimes I'm just looking at things from a different way or a different perspective to others. And actually, that's the bit that makes a difference. So you being able to do things differently to others around you is the way that you start to differentiate yourself and the way that you find yourself that place in a team. Now, the last way to discover your strengths that I'm going to talk about is asking others. And normally in a room, I see people kind of shift in their chair a little bit uncomfortably, and you kind of hear the intake of breath. I'm going to assume on a webinar, I've got some of that as well. I just can't see you doing it. But actually, you don't need to be afraid of asking others. I know there's a fear that people might not tell you things, that they'll only tell you the things that you're not good at, or that they won't be able to think of any strengths, but I can promise you that's not the case. And on this one, what you want to do is ask a group of people what they think your strengths are. Now, we all have a habit of not bringing our whole self to work, so don't just ask people at work. Talk to your family, talk to your friends. If you do hobbies or volunteering things outside of work, talk to people there as well. And at work, you want to talk to people who are in your current team, who see you doing your everyday role. But if you do some kind of extracurricular, maybe you organise events for a network at work, or you are seconded onto a different project one day a week, start to ask people in different areas, because you might see that different roles start to bring out different strengths in you. On colleagues, you want to ask, obviously, your peers, your manager. If you've got people who report into you, then you definitely want to be asking those. If you've got people who are newer into the company or more junior, you want to get a real spread of people that you're asking to get the best view of what you bring and what your strengths are. And it really doesn't have to be complicated. So you can do a nice short email. I've actually done this by text, and I still have the text messages on my phone where I asked friends what they thought my strengths were. But you do something along the lines of, Dear Paula, I'm currently focusing on my personal development, and I want to find out a bit more about my strengths. I'd love it if you could tell me or share with me 3 strengths that you see in me. Even better if you can tell me when and where you've seen me use them. If you come back by the end of the week, that would be fab. Speak soon, Corey. And it doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. You want to be really clear about what you're asking them for. So you're asking them for 3 strengths. You want to ask for some extra detail, and we'll come on to what we can do with some of that later, but that will help you start to see themes of whether there's certain roles or certain activities where you're using your strengths more than others. And you want to set them a deadline, because we all know that everyone's busy. You'll lose things in your email box, but it also gives you a little legitimate reason to chase them if they haven't come back on time. And if you know them well enough to maybe give them a heads up on the final day that you've given them the deadline for, just to say that you're expecting it that day, to make sure that you get things back. And I can promise that people will come up with at least 3 for you. They won't struggle to find some. There'll be some bits that come back and you'll think, yeah, that feels right. There'll be some bits that you've never seen in yourself, and actually it's really nice. Sometimes actually it's just finding the words to explain those strengths, because to you they feel so natural that actually can be really useful in asking others on those bits. And some of it, as I say, it just feels so natural to you that you don't see it as a strength. So seeing what other people call out in you is really good. So I'd say even if you do some of the other bits, I'd highly recommend asking other people what they see your strengths to be. Now, if you've spent some time and you figured out what your strengths are, let's talk a bit next about how you're going to use them to help drive your career forward. So the first bit that I want to touch on is a personal development plan. And in this section, I'm actually going to open up a couple of poll questions. So while I'm talking through the personal development plan, if you can answer the poll questions, and then we'll close it at the end of this session. So I'm just opening them up now. I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer this one, and then we'll come back and we'll answer the second one, and we'll have a look at the details. So on the screen, you can see a personal development plan, and this is just an example of one that I've used. If you have a personal development plan that works for you, just carry on using it. If there's one at work that they want you to use as well, feel free to use it. And if you don't have one, then feel free to copy this one. I am not precious about it, but I want you to find something that works for you. Now, the top half of this personal development plan is probably a little different to what you might see elsewhere. This one is, at the top, I list out what my identified strengths are, identified development areas, and some key experience or deliverables you might put in that. And that's because it depends who you're going to share this with. Now, it is a personal development plan, so it's completely up to you who you share it with. You might want to share it with your manager, and if you have a mentor or a coach at work, I'd probably suggest sharing it with them. But beyond that, you don't need to share it with anyone else. You might choose to share it with others in your team so that they can help you develop those strengths or those development areas that you want to focus on. And actually, if they know, it's easier for them to help you with those. But as I say, it's a personal development plan, so you can keep it entirely to yourself. But if you are going to be sharing it with people, perhaps for end of year reviews or one-to-ones, you want to make sure you're reminding people of what your strengths are and also your key deliverables and experiences, not just the areas that you need to work on. And that's why I think the section at the top is really important. Now, one of the things that I have found working with a lot of clients is that if I ask people, oh, sorry guys, I'll just bring that back to where we are. If you ask people what their strengths are and to list their strengths and their development areas, most of them will have far more development areas than they will strengths. I think, again, it's a natural trait of women for us to start to think that there are more development areas than strengths. And because a lot of those strengths we see as just natural abilities that we think everyone else has, that we don't identify them as strengths. So sometimes it can be a bit tricky to start to work out what those strengths are. And that's why I've talked about those 3 ways that you can work out what they are. Particularly asking others will really help you start to list these. Now I'm just going to open the second poll on these ones. So interesting enough, on the first poll, the answer is that 68% of people do not have a personal development plan and 32% do. Now, from the research that I've done, about 39% of women have their own personal development plan on the go at the moment. So we're a little bit below the average that I've seen there, but hopefully by the end of the session, you will all be looking to go and create a personal development plan, and we'll have much more info on that one. Now, I'm just going to open the second poll. So you've got a couple of minutes to answer that one while we go through the second half of the personal development plan. So the second half is probably much more traditional to what you've seen before. And it's where you start to gather the information for your personal development plan and what you're going to work on. Now, what I'd say here is that on your personal development plan, you need to make sure that you are working on your strengths and pushing those forward, not just working on those development areas that we traditionally work on a personal development plan, because we know that we'll stand out much more by working on our strengths. If we work on those things that we think we should or could be good at but aren't actually our strengths, there'll be many others out there who can do it easier and quicker than us, and if they start to work on it, they'll be far further along that journey than we will. So we need to work on our strengths, not the things that we think should be our strengths. There's a big fallacy when it comes to strengths-based development that we don't focus on those development areas, and that's not true. But the aim is not to spend all your time on development areas to bring them up to a certain level. The aim is to push your strengths far beyond what everyone else can do. You want to make sure that those development areas are not a liability, and you work on them enough that they're not a liability, but you don't continue to work on them to try and be a differentiator. So if you take the example of being able to present, if you find it really difficult to voice a question or to present a report in a room of people, you need to work on that enough that you can be comfortable to do the bits that you need to do. But you're never going to be the person who's going to stand up on stage and talk about the new products in front of people. And you don't want a role that does that if it's not playing to your strengths. That's where you start to find different people in the team to play those different roles. So on this, you want to probably have 3 to 5 things that you're working on. And if you have 5 things, at least 3 of those need to be your strengths. So if I give you the example that I've got here, the area that you're working on, what your objectives are. So on here, I was talking about wanting to gain more sales experience. I wanted to get exposure to the sales process and exposure to clients. And then starting to list out what it was that I was going to do. Now, you might have some areas that you're working on that actually you're going to spend the next 2 years doing, especially if you're doing qualifications. Some of those have quite long lead times. But you want to focus on what you're going to do in the next 6 months. And again, if you have 5 things on this personal development plan, don't do everything in the next 6 months because you'll just never have the time. So you need to start prioritizing what you're going to work on. And as I say, if you're doing this over strengths and development areas, spend more time on those strengths for all those reasons that we talked about before on how they drive your career forwards. So I'm just looking at the results from the second poll. So that is, the answer is 94% of people don't have strengths on their personal development plan. And actually, that's pretty much what I'd expect. Most people don't work on their strengths. They think that their strengths are just naturally there and we don't spend time developing them further, even though they are the thing that will make us stand out. So hopefully after this presentation, you'll all go back, and if you've got a personal development plan, you'll be looking at including your strengths on it. And if you don't, you'll be happy to create one, even if it's just for yourself, or to have one that you can share with your manager for one-to-ones and performance reviews. Now, the next bit that I want to touch on is a success tracker. So you might hear these called different things. I've had success trackers, I've had brag files, but basically this captures all of the information about the things that you've been doing, and this is where you can put some of that information that you start to get from people around what your strengths are and why you want to ask for when and where they've seen you doing them, because you can start to capture it on something like this. Now, personally, I use this success tracker myself, and I've used it for one-to-ones, for end-of-year performance reviews. I've used it in promotion cases, and I've actually used it when I've gone for external interviews as well. And on this, you start to capture all the deliverables that you've done, all the things that you think you should stand out for. So the first bit where we talk about your role or project. Now, if you've done one role for a long time, that doesn't mean you've only got one line to put on here. You'll have different responsibilities that you can put on here. If you work on multiple projects, or you're seconded to do things in different areas, perhaps for certain weeks of the year or maybe for certain days of the week, then capture some of those as different bits. And the more detail you can put in this, the easier it is for you to use at a later date. And you need to kind of keep it up to date. So if I go through the example again on here of how to use the success tracker, this is an example of having a kind of budget responsibility role. So looking at this, talking about a 2019 budget review, and looking at the key responsibility was around calculating variances to the planned spend. So you might have multiple responsibilities depending on how big that role or project was, or you might break them down into different lines. Now, the next bit is around key metrics. You want to capture as much as you can in terms of metrics, and lots of people think they don't have metrics to capture because there isn't something financial. But actually talking about, the number of customers that this will impact, the number of processes that you've written, the number of calls that have been taken. Because actually when you start to use this in examples, you can really bring things to life. It makes you sound much more confident and competent and believable when you're talking in interviews, if you can bring in examples of metrics and of key stakeholders in the next bit as well. Because actually this document becomes really useful in things like when you're doing interviews and they ask you, can you give me an example of a time when you know those type of questions? That's what this document captures. It's a time when you had to work with different teams, when you had to deal with difficult situations, when you were doing something that involved liaising with a committee. Those kind of things are what you start to capture on here. So you want to capture key stakeholders, and if you're talking about this internally, obviously you can use the name of those stakeholders. But if you're talking to people externally, you want to be talking about the kind of job titles or people that you're interacting with. So were you working with the project manager or the program director? Were you talking to certain committees or boards? Because people won't know the names of those individuals if you're in a different company. But by bringing it to life to talk about who you were interacting with, who those key stakeholders were, it really adds gravitas to the examples that you're giving. And you want to capture some feedback. Now, some of this might be what's come through on your strengths ask to others, and some of it you might need to go out and ask specifically for feedback. You do it exactly as I talked through on the strengths. Be really specific about what it is that you're asking. So are you asking for feedback on a specific strength that you want to get an example of, or are you asking feedback on a certain role that you had or project that you were in? Be really specific for people, because the easier you make it for them, the more likely they are to answer it. So don't just ask them for feedback, ask them for feedback on my role in the 2019 budget review, for example. So by using a personal development plan and a success tracker, you can start to drive your career forward by using your strengths. And I just want to touch on a little bit more about how to drive your career forward using strengths. So the first one is around building relationships. So as I touched on at the start, by working out what your strengths are, you can start to trade to others. You can work out what their strengths are and the things that aren't a strength for you. You can see if they'll do instead, and you can pick up instead things for them that aren't a strength for them. You can start to create well-rounded, more effective teams by doing that trade, by knowing the strengths of people around you and by them knowing yours. And zones of genius. So you might have heard these talked about before. So these are from a book called The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks, and I definitely recommend it. The zones that he talks about are incompetence, competence, excellence, and genius. So the zone of incompetence is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's the things that you're not good at. And basically the rule for those is that you should try and avoid or delegate those. Don't spend time in your zone of incompetence. The zone of competence is the things that you can do fine, but so can so many other people. When you're starting out in your career, quite often you'll be spending a lot of time in that zone of competence because it helps the team by you doing some of these things that anyone can do. But the longer that you spend in a role and the more senior that you get, you want to be pushing up into those zones of excellence and genius. So the zone of excellence is where you are doing things that you are really good at. You are starting to differentiate yourself in them. That you're probably making a good living out of it. And it can be quite seductive, the zone of excellence, because you found things that you're good at and things that you're starting to build a reputation about and things that reward you from a good living. But actually, it starts to become a comfort zone and you don't push into that zone of genius. So if I give you some examples here of me, my zone of incompetence is definitely around attention to detail and Excel spreadsheets, because I could never do those. And I would spend as much time as I could avoiding those and finding someone else by asking, trading, and at times begging others to do that instead of me, because I know it would take me so long and it still wouldn't be as accurate as someone else who could do it in 30 minutes when that is a strength of theirs. Zones of competence would be things that, as I say, a lot of other people could take on. But when it got to zones of excellence, this is where I think about my career as a management consultant. So I was a project manager. I was good at that bit. I was very good. I started to differentiate myself from other people. I will come on to it a bit later around my need for over planning, but it definitely played into that project manager space. And I could have spent my whole career being a project manager, and I would have done pretty well. But actually, I wanted to move into my zone of genius, that space around the learning, the handing on the learning, and the building relationships with people, coaching them, was much more into my zone of genius. And the zone of genius is the things that you are uniquely suited to do. They are where we go back to flow that we mentioned earlier, where it doesn't feel like work. You spend 4 hours, it feels like you spent 30 minutes, and it just felt easy and natural. Now, you want to find a job where you are spending time in that zone of genius, the things that don't feel like work. And you want to move out of those zones of incompetence and competence, but you also want to watch out for that kind of comfort zone in that zone of excellence, which is easy to fall into. It will be playing to some of your strengths, but it won't be the things that you're uniquely suited to. Now, I want to touch on a couple of other bits due to the times that we find ourselves in mostly. So I want to talk about managing your manager. And this is particularly important at the moment because most of us are working remotely. So on this, the first bit that I want to say is when you're working with managing your manager, you need to tell them things. I have yet to meet a manager who is psychic. And there are many things that you probably think they should know. And even when you're in the office that they probably should have known. And that might be around the length of time that teams are working, how stressed certain people are, or when someone's done an excellent job. But actually, most managers nowadays are what we'd call player managers. They have a day job as well as having to manage people. And we used to say that managing a person takes up 10% of your time. And if your manager has a day job that takes up 100% of their time, and then they're expected to be managing individuals, things will fall through the cracks. So if there are things that you want your manager to know, especially at the moment when you're working remotely, if there are things that you have done really well or things that you want their help on, you need to tell them. It's far better than they hear about things 2 or 3 times and they don't hear about it at all. So make sure that you are talking to your manager. You need to find time to talk with them as well. And again, the things that we used to take for granted of just bumping into people, being able to ask a question across the desk, doesn't happen so easily when we're working remotely. So you need to be persistent about making sure that you're getting time with them. And actually, when you book the time, if they're not keeping it, make sure that you keep asking and tell them why it's important to you. And if there are specific things that you want to cover with them in those catch-ups, send them a few bullet points beforehand. If you want to talk to them about your strengths, you want to get feedback from them as to what your strengths are, or if you want to say, actually, I've been working on what I think my strengths are, this is what I think they are, and this is how I'd like to do more with them, then tell them that that's what you want to cover in that catch-up, because you'll start making their life easy for them. And the easier you make it for them, the more they'll remember those bits. And that leads me on to looking at their working style. So understanding the strengths and working style of your manager, you can start making their life easier, and actually that will make your life easier. So if you have a manager who wants to be copied in on everything, then copy them in on everything. It might not be your natural style, but if you make it easy for them, they'll remember that when it comes to reviews. If you have a manager who actually only wants a summary at the end of a day or end of a week, and to hear from you when there's a challenge or a problem that you need help with, then start to work that way. So getting to understand their working style and their strengths and starting to play to those for them can really help you manage your manager. Now, as I said, we found ourselves in unusual times at the moment. I think it's fair to say we are in uncharted territory. I don't think anyone on this call will have experienced a pandemic before. And it leads us naturally into a desire for control. And that starts to manifest in a few different ways. For some people, it sees us falling into perfectionism and wanting to not do anything unless we're going to do it perfectly. For some of us, it will be a manifestation of over planning. This is definitely me. So I have an A to Z of every scenario that I think could come up and what I would do in that scenario. Funnily enough, pandemic wasn't on my list before, so it already shows you the problem with this A to Z of we can only plan as far as we can see. And given that we're in something that we've never seen before, trying to plan for it is impossible. Now, sometimes we can see as far as the next few weeks, the next few months. Sometimes I can only see to the next meal of the day because it's one of those days. And by over planning, we end up missing some of the amazing opportunities that will come up at the moment. If I have an A to Z, so 26 plans, and I'm looking out for when those come up because I know what I'm going to do with them, I can bring out plan F because in that scenario, I've already worked out what it is. But actually, I'll miss some of the things that come out that aren't in my 26. And I can guarantee there's going to be amazing opportunities that come out from this time. And if I'm so busy looking for A to Z, I'll miss A1, A2, and A3, which would be far better than anything I could have imagined because they are beyond what I've experienced before. So I want to say, please stay open to those new opportunities. Watch out for falling into the traps of perfectionism and over planning. It is really easy to do, but actually be on the lookout for it. I'm really hoping that we don't go back to the old normal. I think there are some great things that have come from the new normal, whether it's the community spirit that we've seen from people pulling together, the new flexibility and responsibility that people have got in terms of being able to manage their own diaries in a way that we should have had a long time ago and just haven't. But I want to see those new routines and that new normal carry on. But we need to stay vigilant and watch out for those new opportunities that definitely will come and not to fall into some of those traps. So as I said, at the back of this pack, there is a list of the resources that I spoke through, including links to some of the Gallup research, the 2 books and assessments that I mentioned on discovering your strengths, and also The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. When the slides come out, obviously, you'll have all of those details, so no need to scribble them down. So that's me getting toward the end of what I was going to cover. I know there was quite a lot of content in there, so hopefully you can always go back and listen to the recording if there's bits that you think you've missed, but hopefully a lot of it has resonated with you. I'd really love to hear from you after this, to hear what did resonate. If you could let me know, the strengths that you've identified or the changes you want to make to allow you to play to those strengths more, I'd love to hear from you about that. You can get in touch with me on LinkedIn, Corey Burrows. You can find me there, or my email address is up there, corey@careerfullypoised.org. And we'll go into the Q&A in a moment. If there are any questions that you don't feel comfortable asking in this forum, please feel free to reach out to me directly. And if there are any that we don't manage to cover today, we're going to do our best to send them back as email answers after the session. My last ask just before we get to the Q&A is if you know any ladies who have been affected by changes in grad schemes. So there's been a number of grad programs that have been either postponed or cancelled. I'd love to speak to them. I'm doing some research in this space, and I'd also, in exchange for them talking to me about their experiences, I'd love to offer them a gifted coaching session, because I know it's really uncertain times for graduates out there at the moment. It's affected me and the work that I do with companies on grad schemes, and I know for those who are planning to start their careers that way, it could be really unsettling. And I'd really love to speak to them about their experiences, but also give them a coaching session to help them in these uncertain times. So if you do know any ladies who are in that position, if you can introduce me to them, point them my way on either LinkedIn or that email address above, that would be fantastic. And that is hopefully a nice rounded kind of a bit of time. I think we've got 13 minutes or so to cover some of the Q&As. So at this point, I think Paula's going to come back and join us, and we'll pick up some of the questions that have come through during the session.
Thank you very much, Corey. That was really, really interesting. And it's, you know, it is fascinating that we focus so little on our strengths. You know, the poll results showed that we're so focused on those development areas. I've got some questions coming through. So first off, Alex has asked a question to do with you talking about the employee engagement and acknowledging that it's very infrequently that we are incentivized through engagement, and it's always through pay and promotion. So the question is, how can we find out or investigate what the key or top incentives are for those around you in the team, and what are the examples of the kinds of incentives that we can move forward with, rather than just pay and bonuses?
Yeah, so I mean, the first bit is talking to individuals about it. I think the challenge that we have with almost everything at work is falling into a trap of one size fits all and assuming that works for everyone. So talking to individuals about actually what their motivations are, because there are times when actually their motivation will be financially driven, it will be promotion driven, and actually as things change in our personal lives, that starts to impact what affects our working lives as well. I think I have a real hate of the phrase work-life balance, because I think they tend to suggest that they're different things, and they're really not. Work is just a fundamental big part of our lives, but they aren't separate. And so I think you need to talk to people about what is important to them in their circumstances. Some of the good examples I've seen are companies that use passions and help people work out what their passions are and give them a chance to do that at work. It might not be their whole job, but it might be something. And if I use the example for me of those lunch and learns, where I was actually helping share details with women who are starting out in their careers, that my company would pay for the room and the lunch, and that's what I asked them to do. They then suddenly had me far more engaged, because I was doing the things that I loved, because I got to talk about helping people build their careers. And actually they had more engaged women starting out, because they were getting to talk about their careers, ask the questions that they hadn't felt comfortable asking before. So actually, by helping people work out what some of those passion projects might be and do those, they'll feel more engaged, and they'll feel that they have the opportunity to do some of those bits at work. So that's some of the good examples that I've seen of where places let you use some of your passions and your strengths for either the day job or for actually something that you can do alongside it, until you can get to the point where you can do the day job in it.
Okay, thank you. So we've got some feedback coming through from Christine, talking about documenting strengths, and she just saying that we'll definitely be using that going forward in development plans. And we've got a question in from Rebecca asking, is there a risk that if you have a strength that you haven't identified yet, and by focusing on your identified strengths, you could be missing out on discovering something that you're really good at? So actually honing in too much on one thing, but if something else slips by, like a hidden strength or talent.
So there is. What I'd probably say is for most of us, by the time we've got a few years into our career, we probably have tried most things through school and through work. But there will be hidden talents that people have. But there's normally an underlying talent that you work on that becomes a strength. if that makes sense. So it's discovering what those underlying talents are. There might be, you know, the hidden musician who never had the chance to play the piano and suddenly they can play kind of concert pianist style, but actually for most of us, we will have tried most of those things. What I do say to people starting out, and if there's anyone early on their career in the call, is to start off with, almost start by being that yes woman and say yes to almost any opportunity, any work task that comes your way. People are so quick to put you in a box, and once you're in that box, it's incredibly hard to get out of it. So the more things that you can try early on, the better, because you'll have that chance to try lots of different things and work out if there is something that you just never had the chance to try before and discover that you're really good at it. Then actually that's one of the ways of figuring it out. So if you're unsure and you feel that you fell into one of those paths, like I did straight out of uni, and you didn't necessarily get the chance to learn outside, actually spend a bit of time being a yes woman for a while. Ask people if there is something that you can help them with, and you might discover an untapped kind of talent or strength. I think the older you get, the less likely it is, because while you might not have found it at work, you've probably found it outside of work. But there are definitely parts that you won't. And if you're early on, yeah, try as much as you can, because yeah, once you're in that box, it's very hard to get out of it.
And I think I would echo that, that unfortunately companies are very quick to put people into certain categories and certain boxes, and I've seen that happen with team members that I've had in the past, where other management colleagues have said, oh, well, they only do that. And I was like, well, have you actually given them a chance to do something else? And they're trying to break out of that little box that they put in. And, you know, it's about working to try and give them the opportunity to try something else. And unfortunately, some managers are a bit risk averse. I think we start to see that changing a bit, and I think that's where the time we're in just now actually is an opportunity for some of those strengths to come through and for people to start moving out of those boxes.
Absolutely. There's never been a better time for innovation.
Yeah. Christine's system added a comment about saying, I feel attitude contributes to success as well as identifying strengths. Any thoughts on that?
I'd say yes, or certainly for me, attitude over experience. Absolutely. When I was hiring people, I would rather have someone who had an attitude of enthusiasm and willingness to learn than someone who thinks they know it all, because I think that's much easier to work with on those bits. So I think for me, it's more that differentiation rather than strengths. I think strengths and attitudes actually start to lead to the same thing, whereas actually it's the kind of experiences and the things that people have done before versus attitude. I'd always take attitude over that in my experience of leading people. I think I can probably teach them what they need to know about the company or the product, but actually if they're not willing to learn, or if they're not engaging and driven, then you can't teach someone that.
No. Okay, thank you for that. So if anyone else has got any questions, we've just got a couple of minutes left. I do have one question that I came up with as we went through, hope you don't mind. Why do you think we focus so much on development areas? So, you know, my experience of having a PDP in the past is, you know, we'll just talk about your strengths for a while, but yeah, you've got to do better in all these development areas. You know, why is that, and how can we start to move away from that kind of approach?
I think there's a couple of bits. So traditionally in companies, that's what they've looked at, by trying to raise that bottom line of the kind of stop making mistakes in certain areas rather than trying to push the kind of innovation in other areas and play to those strengths. And actually some of it goes back to things like the depression back in the 30s, and actually the risk averse bit and that nature that came out of companies, that people focus much more on trying to stop the risks emerging rather than trying to actually work on the strengths. And actually the research from Gallup only really came out in the kind of 90s to really focus on strengths, and it still hasn't got as much traction as I think it should have. I think women as well, there's a real tendency in this space for us to spend much more time looking at our development areas than our strengths, and I think that is actually something that goes back to kind of society as a whole, where they always talk about with little kids when you see them that boys want to be first and girls want to be right, and therefore with that one, and you'll see it playing out in meetings sometimes, where actually the first person to ask the question and they don't worry about what the question is, will often be men asking the question first, and women will only ask a question if they think they know the answer, because they want to be right in the question that they ask. And that lends us as well. You can see it play out when people start to write their list of strengths and their list of development areas, is that women will often have more development areas than strengths, because we worry about being right, and therefore we notice much more the things that we aren't right on rather than the things that we are.
Yeah, yes, I think yeah, I agree with you. You there?
I mean, that's generalization. It's not for everyone, but yeah,
No.
in my experience, it's much more likely to have a long list of development areas than a long list of strengths as a woman.
Claire has popped a question into the box to say she's done the Gallup Strengthsfinder. She did it a few years ago, and she thinks, yeah, it still applies, but she's not quite sure how to start stepping into them properly. So what's a good way to start pushing forward with the strengths and making more of them, and and developing that particular area?
So the first bit is to make sure that you are recording them, as we talked about before, and so that you can start to talk about them in a more practical way. Because the slight challenge of things like the Strengthsfinder is it is a bit generic and high level. So if I take the example of learner, which was my top one, on that one, as I said, it kind of talks about, an ability to learn and loving the process of learning, not just what you learn. But actually what you need to work out is where you're using that at work. So that's that example of, you've got that learner is a strength, but actually asking people when they've seen you using that, and start by asking for those examples of actually when they've seen these strengths at work. So asking people specifically for feedback on them is a great way, because you'll then start to see the practical situations where you're using it, and you can start to do more of it. So for me, the way that I started playing out with learner was going, actually, I'm really good at getting my feet under the table, getting into something quick, getting up to speed as quick as I can, which means actually being thrown into unknown situations or places where I'm the first person into a project works really well for me. And actually waiting for others, because they want to have all the documentation to read, and actually I'll go and ask the people what I need to know. So I'd start by, if you've got those lists from Strengthsfinder, then actually ask people specifically for when they've seen you using these, and then you'll start to see a trend as to when you're using them at work in a practical nature, and you can start to look at how you could do more of that.
Thank you. And Caitlin, so she's come back, and probably our last one we can take this evening. I love what you said about teams being well-rounded, not people. Where have you seen good examples of management considering strengths when putting teams together, and how do you suggest raising this within my own workplace and teams? Good question.
It is a great question, actually, and it's something that actually I don't think people do recognise enough. I've seen it sometimes when people are putting together projects for really important or really tight deadlines, where they will start to discuss who's the right person to put into the project. So often when people are seconded out of their teams, it's for their specific skills or strength or experience. But actually in day-to-day teams, we don't look at that. I was lucky in my work as a consultant, because we got to start new project teams on quite a regular basis. And so when you brought a team together, you could do that, and you could actually have that kind of forming session at the start of talking about actually what are people's strengths and how do they like to work. As a manager, I used to sit down with every person who joined my team. We'd have lunch or a coffee, and sometimes that was bring your lunch, let's go and talk. And I'd talk to them individually about what their working style was. I'd tell them about what my working style was. I'd ask about what was important to them outside of work, because I felt like knowing those things was really important for me to understand them as an individual and how we work as a team. So if you're a leader, I'd say do that. And it's never too late to do that time with your team of just sitting down and getting to know them individually. Actually getting them to do it together so that they start to talk about. And again, the times that we find ourselves in now with lockdown has been a perfect time, because so many people get an insight into, you can see my house. You start to see what's important for people when their kids appear, or their cat or their dog, and you start to learn more about them as an individual. That actually now gives you a perfect opportunity to do those things of finding out, what's important for them, and also what their preferred ways are working. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to be able to get their ways of working, but actually just acknowledging when you've got people who are more introverted, for example, when you're in a meeting, knowing that they're more introverted and they want a bit of time to read things or digest things before they're going to have an answer, they'll probably have a far more thought through answer than most of the extroverts sat in the room, but you know that you need to give them that time. So if you're a leader, take the time to get to know people individually. And if you're not, perhaps suggest, and now you could do it virtually at the moment, of actually, could we have a team session where we talk about, you know, we've had time to reflect during lockdown, what's important to us and how we like to work, what's worked well when you've been working from home, and actually what you've missed. And those will start some of those conversations. If you're in a company that's going to go back to an office, then actually a great time when you start landing back in an office is to start doing these bits. You can almost start over again. You can create those new boundaries at the moment. It's a great time to have those conversations, and things that you found that have worked for you when you're at home, see if you can carry them on into the workplace. If that's at, you know, 10 o'clock, pop out for a bit of fresh air. See if you can keep that going when you go back to the office. Work out what those boundaries are, those habits that you want to keep going, and try and take them with you.
That's good. That's good tip, actually. That's really good good answer. Thank you so much, Corey. We've come to the end of the session. We're just after the 12:30 time slot. So I'd just really like to say thank you very much, Corey, for doing the session today. It's been fascinating talking about strengths, and I think very much it's something we need to focus on more, rather than, you know, the more negative side of, oh, this is what you need to develop on. I'd like to thank everybody for attending today and for your questions. As Corey said, if you do have other questions for her, contact details will be in the pack. And we look forward to welcoming you into our other events that we're planning through the year. So thank you very much, everyone. Good evening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.